The time I defeated the audit team. Now you've got to understand, I come from General Electric background when I got out of the Army, hired right into GE to be a black belt, and if the audit team said it, it was the gospel. So anytime now doing continuous improvement, I hear that the audit team said something, I remember that, but I also want to challenge them. So in this case, major insurance company in the United States does have a large presence in Japan. They do something every year where they audit the claims that they handled to see if they were done correctly. And in the insurance industry, this is a board level reported metric called the error rate. So this goes to the board. I was sitting at a cubicle at this time, teaching MBA at Georgia Tech, and I get a call on my bat phone, and it was my contact at the insurance company. He said, "Lee, we need help. What do you need?" Quality has gone in and found an error rate of 13%. So 13% of claims were not handled correctly. The audit team has come in and found an error rate of 19%. And the board wants to know why there's a difference, and the board, of course, is leaning toward the audit team. So I went down and decided to assess this process. What are my thoughts on this process? So I'll tell you, it sounded pretty good. There was a population of about 450,000 accident claims, and what the quality department did was used a sample size calculator with an error rate of plus or minus 2%. Very timely with the presidential election going on to talk about a margin of error. So that means their rate is anywhere from 11 to 15%, because clearly they're not going to count 450,000 claims. Now, what their sample size calculator told them to do was to look at 1,345 claims. And they found an error rate of 13%, which was 175 claims handled incorrectly. Audit goes in. This was my first red flag. Audit does, and I understand there were only 2 auditors, but they do a plus or minus 4%. And that means they're anywhere from 15 to 23. And that tells them to look at 47 claims. I'm sorry, they found 47. The sample size calculator told them to look at 245. So I have my first issue. Quality looked at 1,345 claims. Audit looks at 245. Plus or minus 2%, plus or minus 4%. But in the world of statistics, what I've got to help the client understand is that 13 could equal 19. And you say, well, how can that be so? Because we did a sample of a population. We did not look at all the claims. And for those of you that don't use a lot of statistics, if you have all the data, like all the data, you looked at all the claims, then you don't need to do statistics. 13 does not equal 19. But because we did not do that, the first thing I need to do is to go into my software of choice, which is Minitab, and I need to do a 2 proportions test. So my first question really was, should audit have brought this up? 13 could equal 19. The board doesn't understand that. Most executives don't understand that because I hate to say this, we're just not using statistics that much in corporate America. So I do the 2 proportions test. Does 1,345 finding 175 to be bad, does that equal, this is my null hypothesis, does that equal 245 finding 47 to be bad? The p-value was less than 0.05, so I accept the null hypothesis. So I can now say to leadership, 19 doesn't equal 13. But this is a sample of a population. I happen to notice this versus that. So most hypothesis tests that we have, we can also run a sample size calculator on the appropriate sample size for the hypothesis test. So I went into my friend Minitab, and I'm not going to get into statistics, but you get something called alpha, and you can get something called beta. And I like to use like just street level talk. Alpha is saying, are they different? And the answer is yes, okay? It has to do with error and things like that. Beta is sort of like, bro, you didn't even look at enough to have this conversation. Or, yeah, you looked at more than enough to have this conversation. So the point is, it's one thing to say there's a difference, but you also need to say, did you look at enough things to say there's a difference? So I went into my software mini tab and I said, how many claims do we need to look at, both of them need to look at, to have a power of 0.90? And again, I'm not going to make this a stats class, but if alpha is 0.95, beta is 0.90, and basically, I'm swagging it here, but it was over 750 claims. So each group needed to look at least 750 claims to even have the conversation of, does 13 equal 19? So basically, I wrote in my report that the audit team should have never brought this up because they did not look at enough claims to have this conversation. I also question why audit didn't just look at the same claims that, that quality looked at. There was a bunch of discussions there. And I left them with the biggest issue is, how do I even know, let's say they had a sample size large enough, how do I know that audit and quality are actually measuring good claim the same way? And that is called an attribute agreement analysis. Quick example, at Home Depot, we were spending $3 million a year on a third-party vendor going around to all the stores measuring whether or not customers were greeted all over the United States and Canada. And then my first question was, what's the definition of a greet? You need to ensure that Bob in Atlanta, mystery shopping a store, is measuring the greets the exact same way that Sally in New Mexico is measuring the greets. If they're not even measuring a greet the same way, this whole measurement system is nonsense. So I'll just, I won't get into this, but basically we did an attribute agreement analysis and basically proved that none of them were measuring claims the same way. Meaning I didn't even trust this. 10 claim handlers giving the same claims did not give me the same results. So really what this ended up being was a redesign of the whole quality program to ensure that claims were being handled correctly. And of course, any of us in Lean Six Sigma know the goal is to not have defects in the first place so that we don't have to, at the end of the year, look and see how many defects we made. So this is my story on how I defeated the audit team. And to be fair, there was only 2 of them. They were not very well trained in statistics, nor was the quality department, and we ended up working with both of them to make a better process. Okay,